Hi everybody, in this video we're going to start writing some JavaScript code to validate our forms. So we'll start off by creating a separate validation.js file and linking it with a script tag and just making sure that we have all that set up correctly. So we can create the file and I am going to just log something to the console so that we can verify that it's working once we have it set up. And we need a script tag, just like we did for index.js. Then go back to the browser, and it is working. So we have it set up. We have the validation function set up. The validation file set up, sorry. Now, how do we get started on this? Well, a lot of the code is already written for us in the lesson on the subject. And this is actually an important skill to master, is reading through existing code and implementing it in your own project. And yes, you'll need to make a number of changes. A lot of this code is very close to already written for us with just a few suitable changes. I think most of the changes that we'll need to make are here in this enable validation function. So let's try to get started here. Oh, of course. All right. So to start with, we want an enable validation function. And let's read through what does this enable validation function do? Well, it starts off by grabbing an array of all the elements with the form class. And yes, that is what we want to do. We need to grab an array of all the elements with the form class, then iterate over those elements, and basically call this setEventListeners method on each one. What we don't need to do is iterate over the field sets because we don't have any field sets. And we actually don't even need to do this. It's not going to be necessary in most cases to set another submit listener because we are already setting them elsewhere. So you wouldn't necessarily need to do this. You could do this and then you wouldn't need to prevent the default behavior elsewhere, but in general, this is not strictly necessary. So really, a lot of this code we don't need. What we need is to get an array of all the form elements and call the setEventListeners method on each one, passing it as an argument. And then we'll go from there. So let's get started by creating this function. Having trouble typing. And we're also going to call it. That's the only way that code gets run. This is like the entry point. So this function is going to select all the forms, iterate through the forms, and set the necessary event listeners on each one. And the event listeners are really what makes this whole thing work. The event listeners are going to be right here. We're going to be setting event listeners on each of the input elements, and every time the input element is changed, we are going to check whether the input is currently valid, and if it is not valid, we show input error messages, and we'll also toggle the button state appropriately depending on whether or not the inputs are all valid. So, and that's really what makes this whole validation file work. Okay, so first thing, we need to select an array or an array-like structure of the forms. But now this isn't going to work. And I encourage you to think about, why is this not going to work? Well, let's take a look. We'll log into the console, go back to the browser, empty array, no forms. This is because we don't have any elements with the class form. Ours say modal double underscore form. And being able to figure out and make these adjustments is really a very important skill that eventually becomes kind of second nature. So now, there we go. That looks correct, right? It's an array containing the two form elements that we have. That's perfect. Now, I'm also thinking, since we are just going to be iterating with the for each loop, I don't think we even need to do array.from, because what we get when we use query selector all is a node list. And node lists, as far as I recall, already have access to the for each method. There's other stuff that they don't have access to. So like if we needed to use the map method, then we would definitely need to use array.from to turn it into an array. Okay, so we've got form list, right? And as we said, we need to iterate over it. So form list dot for each form, I'll say form L to be a little more precise and descriptive, because these are form elements that we're talking about. We need to call this method that doesn't exist yet, the setEventListeners method, and pass it the form element as an argument. So let's just go ahead and create this method that we're referring to, because actually, before we do that, what do you think is going to happen if we go to the browser now? The answer, I believe, would be an error. Yep, setEventListeners is not defined. Kind of makes sense because, we haven't defined it yet. So let's go and define it. setEventListeners equals, and yes, you could use function declarations also. Either of them will be perfectly fine for this. Now, one of the first things that you want to consider when you're writing functions is does it accept arguments and how many arguments, etc. So we are passing it the form element, and we're basically doing this because I said we need to, but that's how we will know which form to run the stuff on inside here. So if we're passing it an argument, it won't do anything unless we specify it as a parameter. And I'll use the same parameter name here, but it's really important to recognize that that's not necessary. You could call it anything and it would still amount to the same thing. So here I can log console.log this thing, and what it's going to do is it's going to log the first form, then it's going to log the second form. First form, second form. Because this is just an arbitrary identifier. But in this case, I think it is fine to call it the same thing. So form L will be the form element. And what do we need to do on the form element? Well, here we can refer back to what we already have in place. And this is pretty much covering what we need to do. So we need to select an array, or really we don't even need an array. We just need to select the node list of our input elements. We'll need to select the button element, which is the submit button. I think we'll need to do this, call toggle button state. This is what will ensure that the button will be disabled to begin with, although that might not work in all cases. We might leave this behind for now. But this is the pretty critical. We will then iterate through the input list, the list of the inputs that we got up here, iterate through it, and set an event listener on each one. And the event listener is going to cover what happens every time you change stuff in the form field. So let's do that. And I'm just going to copy and paste this because being able to successfully copy and paste stuff into your project is actually a good skill to cultivate. So here, we can't just use it as is. And how you could recognize that, well, one way would be the same thing that I've been doing to log this stuff to the console. So if we log input list and button element to the console, what do you think we're going to see? Well, we're actually not going to see anything from those log statements because there's another issue. Form element is not defined. So this is the other way to get information about, like, sometimes you don't even need to log to the console. Just check the console for errors. Always be checking the console for errors. Very important. So it is saying form element is not defined, right? That's what it said, I believe. Yep. So how can we resolve this? What do you think? There are basically two ways. One, we could change the name of this parameter to match what is already in use here. Because remember, this is just an arbitrary identifier. Or if we would prefer to be more brief, we could then change all of these to form L. Because that's all that we're doing here is trying to reference the form element from inside that's being passed as an argument. Because we want to search this form for all the input elements. But now what do you think we're going to get here? Null and an empty array. So the empty array is from the input list, and null is from the button element. Try to fix this. I'll show you how in a minute, but try and do it on your own. You definitely know how. And we've already done it for one of the elements. Okay, so the fix here is to use the appropriate classes. Modal double underscore input and modal double underscore button. Now if we go back, we see that we have a list of the inputs and we have our button element. Note that it's only logging for one of the forms, and that's because we have an error occurring, and this error is going to stop the rest of the execution. So we're only getting to one of the forms and erroring before we get to the other form. So what we need to do next is resolve the error message. This bit we're just going to handle initial states. We'll deal with that a little bit later. So that also just removed the error, so that's fine. We'll go with that. Because the error was firing because we hadn't defined a toggle button state function. But so that's going to be one of the next things we need to do, is define these functions. I'll also note that often you'll see this as change. That's what I would go for. I think in many cases, input and change can be used interchangeably, but there are some subtle differences. Okay, so where are we now? Let's go back to our example here and try to understand what's going on. We've got these two functions, the toggle button state function and the check input validity function. Let's just focus on check input validity. So note that we're calling it and passing it the form element and the input element. So this is an individual input element, the one on which the event has just fired. So when we type here, it's going to, the input element is going to be email. When we type here, the input element is going to be the password input. So we need to write the check input validity function. And really, it's going to look very similar to this. We could probably even just copy and paste it, but I'll try to write it by hand here. So const check input validity equals remember what I said about the parameters. We need to specify parameters, And they don't need to be the same. So if you wanted to change them up, that's perfectly fine. But the first one should be the input list, and the second one should be the button. This input validity function, what is it doing? It is checking whether the input is valid or not. And it's doing so by this validity.valid property. This is built into input elements. And let's start by actually logging that to the console so we can take a closer look. Console.log inputs. I'm sorry, I got this mixed up. I was looking at the wrong one. It's supposed to be the form element and the input element. So let's take a look at input elements.validity and see what it looks like. To be able to look at this, we need to go to the browser. We need to open up a modal and then type something. Toggle button state is not defined. So what we need to do here is just comment that out for now. We'll focus on one thing at a time. Check input validity. So go back to here, try that again. I think I was looking in the wrong place. It's a little slow to log that to the console. Maybe it should be input and not change. Yep. So pardon me, I must have gotten confused. It should be input. It shouldn't be change. So here we see what the validity state is. We type in there and it says, let's just refresh so I make sure that I have the correct value. Here it says too short, true. Because remember, we said it should have 2 characters. And valid, false. Now what happens if we add a character? It says too short is now false. In fact, all of these things are false, but valid. Valid is true. So this is what we're going to make use of. If input L.validity.valid is true, then we want to, well, do nothing. But if input validity.valid is not true, this is when we want to apply styles to make our error messages appear. So let's go ahead and do that. If not this, then we need to make these error messages appear. And how are we going to do that? Well, the way it's done here is via this show input error message. And actually, I said we want to do nothing if this is true. That's not the case either. We're going to call the hide input error method. So we haven't written any of these functions. The next thing that we're going to write is the show input error function. So here we have the way that we're calling the show input error function. And take a look that it requires 3 arguments: the form element, the input element, and the validation message. And the validation message is another property of input elements. So we could log this to the console to see what it looks like. Console.log input L.validation message, right? Now let's go back to here, open, type in. Here's the validation message. This is what we want to display. Now if we type again, it's just empty. So it's an empty string. So validation message will be empty if there's no validation error. Okay, so to make use of this, well, the first thing we need to take into account is that oops, these are the wrong variable names. We're using form L and input L. So we would need to update this so that we're using things that are defined. And we need to write the show input error function. Oops. Const show input error. This one needs to accept 3 arguments. And I'm just going to stick with calling them the same thing that we've been calling them. Except for this one, we can't call it input L dot validation message. That doesn't work. You can't specify, like you have to just use a name here, not an actual value like this object property. And that's why it's telling us this is no good. We could call it error message or something like that. What does the show input error function need to do? Now is when we can start to interact with the HTML. We need to select a specific one of these input elements and add some text to it. That's basically what we need to do to make it visible. Now, how do we select one of these? Because right now they just have a class. There's no way that we could really target this specific message the way that it's set up now. So one way that we can do this is by establishing relationships between each of the input elements and their error messages. And we can establish this relationship by using IDs. There are other ways we could do it, but this is a convenient way, and we are not likely to mess it up later on because you can only have one ID per the IDs need to be unique, so we're not going to run into collisions. So one way that we could do this is by giving the span tags an ID that is identical to the ID of the input element, but with some other thing attached to it. So this ID is for the input element, and then this ID is for the span tag. Now we can make use of this in JavaScript by searching for, well, let's start like this. Const error message ID equals input L dot ID plus dash error. And let's log error message ID to the console. And let's see what we get here. And I've only established this relationship for the image URL, so let's check that out. And I'm looking at the wrong code there. This is the wrong project. All right, go back to the console. And look at that. Does that look familiar? That happens to be exactly the ID that we just put on that span tag. So this is how we can uniquely identify the span tag that we want to insert the info into. So let's just carry on then. What do we need to do next? Well, if we want to insert text into this element, we need to select it, right? So we can do const error message L for the element equals document.querySelector error message ID. Well, actually, we would need to do this hash in front because remember, you need to have a hash in front to select something based on an ID. Then, if we do error message L dot text content equals error message Let's see what happens. Yeah, look at that. The error message disappeared. And the correct error message appeared there. And if we make it valid, the error message is still there, even though we made it valid because we haven't written the function that makes it not valid, that makes it disappear. So, but basically, this is an important step here, and there are potentially a few refinements that we could make. For instance, if we wanted to, we could do this all in one line. This is optional. You don't have to, but it's good to know how to do this. We could do it all in one line by using a template literal and embedding the error message ID in here, but then we could stick this inside. We don't even need to use concatenation. We could just do this. And this should amount to the same exact thing because we're just creating a string that starts with a hash, ends with dash error, and in the middle, it has the input element's ID. And let's just verify that this still works, that I didn't make any errors. Yep, still works just the same. Okay, so your homework assignment now at the end of this video is to implement this same exact thing for the other error messages. So go through and make sure that they all have this same relationship where each error message has an ID that is composed of the ID of the corresponding input with the additional dash error string. And then join me in the next video where we work on hiding the error messages after they appear, when the input is no longer invalid.